Hello and welcome to the Patreon channel of True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So I have just watched the first couple of minutes of the Netflix documentary up until the opening title where it says American Murder, The Family Next Door, and it's around about 3 or 4 minutes into it. My impression is just very, in a kind of a general sense, a global sense. I think it's done in a very clean and neat way. It sort of starts off with Shanann's Facebook page sliding into view, her voice, and then there are a couple of family spiels that are shown. Most of us, I think, have seen most of them, or all of them. I certainly have. And they're very familiar to us, but there's a slight undercurrent of something in them. For example, in one of them, Shanann says to Chris, he's going to do the dishes, like on camera, and then he says, "That's me," or something like that. And then there's also the pie in the face thing, but overall it's sort of this happy family vibe that is sketched. And then it jumps to, so basically that is building a relationship with ultimately the victims, the children and Shanann, and providing brief glimpses of Chris Watts. And then it cycles over to August the 13th. There's no voiceover, there's no narration, it's just Shanann arriving home. And then the calls from Nicole Atkinson, one after the other, then texts. The first call isn't time-stamped, but the next texts are. And then finally, I think just before 12, Nicole says, "I'm coming over." And that is when the body cam of Officer Coonrod starts kicking in. Now, this is where I want you to pay attention to something that you may not have registered before. You may not have noticed before. Some of you may have noticed it, some not. But this is the point of True Crime Rocket Science, is to pay attention to these details. I don't think I've seen what I'm about to say to you referenced anywhere in the discovery, and yet you can hear it as clear as a bell in this documentary. Not once but twice. If you didn't hear it in the beginning, and it's, as I said, it's very early on, it's in the opening montage. If you didn't hear it in the beginning, play it again. And it's quite simple. It's the moment Officer Coonrod heads to the door and he knocks on it. You hear a dog answering. You hear a dog kind of replying to that knock. And it's Dieter. Dieter barks a couple of times. Then there's some more talking, and then the officer goes back to the door and does the same thing, and the dog responds once again. Now you might think, so what? A dog barking, that's very inconsequential, and that is what everyone thought. Officer Coonrod thought that's why I didn't add it into his report. Nicole Atkinson thought that's why she never mentioned it, and she'd been dog sitting. The dog isn't consequential. The dog's not important. It's an insignificant detail. Of course, with True Crime Rocket Science, you really want to pay attention to the details. And so what does this mean? The fact that you can hear the dog, but you don't see him. So the dog's in the house, but you can't see him. Well, what it means is the dog has been sequestered somewhere in the house that is within earshot, so the dog can hear someone knocking at the door, and you can barely hear the dog barking. So where could the dog be for that to be possible? And I think the answer is likely in the basement area. That's where the dog is being left. And what this immediately addresses is the issue of premeditation. In other words, if Chris Watts had the dog tied up somewhere, right, then it means that, and Shanann, as far as he was concerned, he left Shanann alive at home, then it means that Shanann had to have tied the dog up, and that would be an inconvenient just scenario to address in an interrogation scenario, which was definitely going to come up. So, because remember, that's his story. He left, they were still alive, but now why is the dog tied up? So the dog couldn't be tied up if Shanann left suddenly. The dog is tied up because there's a premeditated situation where either Watts decides what's going to happen, or Shanann decides, I'm going to leave and I'm going to tie the dog up. The other side to bear in mind, of course, is given the reality of the crime, do you want a dog barking, and do you want the dog running around the scene, potentially contaminating it to an extent? Something that maybe you've cleaned up. In other words, if you've cleaned a floor, running paw prints of bleach or whatever it is all over, would you want that to happen? If you've cleaned the kitchen, the dog sort of running through that, leaving, possibly transferring evidence from one place to the other, possibly sniffing out sheets or whatever it is. No, you wouldn't want that to happen. One aspect that, if I could speak to some of the people in this case, I would ask them, what was Shanann's habit usually if she left the house? Would she leave Dieter inside the house, or would she leave him in the garden? And I'd be interested to know, because obviously if Dieter is left inside the basement, ordinarily, then that doesn't necessarily raise suspicion. All I'm saying is just the fact that Dieter was where he was should have been part of the narrative and should have also indicated that something was wrong. Because I've got a dog, and if I went out, I wouldn't put him kind of under the staircase. I guess it's the closest I've got to a basement. I would put him either in the garden, which I don't do that often, or I would put him in the kitchen, but in a cordoned off sort of area. The thing that I would be very aware of is that his barking would draw attention if I was away for an extended time. I don't think he would bark as much if he was in the garden, but if he was in the garden, it would also be indicative that I wasn't home. In other words, if he's in the garden but the doors are closed and he starts barking and that kind of thing. In other words, the dog could draw attention in a scenario where a crime has been committed. So just the fact that Dieter is barking opens up a whole dimension. And the reason it's important is you see the same thing in other cases like Henry van Breda. The same scenario, the dog was sequestered during the commission of the crime. And the real question is, at what time was Dieter put in the basement? And I think the answer is probably early Sunday evening, and he was there from then on. I made a point in one of my narratives that when Shanann arrived at the door, Dieter wasn't there. And I think the reason for that is he was sequestered already. He was already out of the way. The other thing is the dog probably has the ability to, if not set off alarms, activate them to show movement in certain areas. And so in a premeditated scenario, putting the dog out of the way makes sense, but it also points to premeditation. I'm just showing you an aspect that I don't think many people have even thought about. Okay, and so moving on, we're now at about 5 minutes into the program. It's about 2 hours long. And then you see Chris Watts. To be 100% accurate, it's 1 hour and 23 minutes long, so about 83 minutes long. Anyway, so then it jumps to Chris Watts arriving home, and as he enters the garage, it sort of cuts. So that sort of furtive fumbling he does there, we don't see. And then they are in front of the door, and Chris Watts then opens the door. One other thing to mention is Nicole Atkinson's son's face isn't sort of blurred out. In previous documentaries it was, possibly because he was underage. So what's quite interesting, at the 6 minute mark exactly, so 6 minutes into the documentary, Chris Watts approaches the door, and as he opens it, Sandy can be heard saying, "Nikki, I give you permission to go into my daughter's house." And the policeman has actually just said, and Sandy's heard it, the policeman has just said, it's not legal for him to enter the house without the owner's permission, the owner being Chris Watts. And so you kind of have a situation here where this could have fucked up the whole investigation. Just that thing. If Sandy had gotten away and Nikki just at that point just walked inside the house. Imagine if it was unlocked and it wasn't latched, or if she'd gone in via the other way. You could have had a defense case just saying, even if it was for a couple of seconds, you could have said no, she contaminated the scene. Even with Chris Watts' permission, you had all of these individuals trampling effectively through a crime scene. And that is something people have been talking about, appeal. I don't think Chris Watts can afford it. And I don't think he has much hope of winning much out of it. He might win a little bit, but his defense could have had a field day with this particular thing. And here you have it on tape. Sandy saying, "You've got my permission to go in," but legally, that's a very big boo-boo if that had happened. Bear in mind also, Nicholas Atkinson finds Shanann's phone. A defense attorney could argue that, well, how do we know that what's on her phone is blah 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 and that whole thing? So I'm just saying you have all of these problems sort of coming up. Just one more point I want to make is I don't remember ever hearing Sandy's voice at this point. If you guys have, let me know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I kind of get the feeling it was redacted or muffled or whatever, that you didn't hear it in the original. Am I right? Now, I don't know what Nicole Atkinson says to Nicholas when he enters, but he suddenly turns around and goes out. I don't know whether she tells him wait outside. It's just inaudible. But he does sort of set foot in the door, and he is later in the house. I think that's going to be it for those folks on YouTube. End of the preview. I'll continue the analysis, of kind of a light analysis, on Patreon. So thank you for listening.